Now, this presentation is an hour-long presentation, and I put it up mainly so that everybody could see the whole thing. But I'm going to really whiz through pieces of it, and we can come back. And what I'm going to try to do is take some of the generic and theoretical things that Mark said and both illustrate how they work in practice, and secondly, really to try to discuss what California's grid is going to look like in 2030, assuming that we achieve all the policy objectives that we now have, and to talk about how that then sets us up for something that's even deeper penetrations in the 2050 time frame. So next, please. Okay, next. I'm going to whiz through a lot of the fronts. Okay, this slide illustrates the issue. The line that you see there is the trajectory of carbon emissions from basically today out to 2050. And that line represents California's AB 32, Governor Brown's pronouncements about where California is headed between now and 2050. And that's an 80% reduction from 2012 levels by 2050. Coincidentally, 2012 is about the same as 1990 in California. So this represents the trajectory of emissions. And the study that we're talking about is the study of the grid in 2030. And then we show 4 dots along that graph there in 2030. And the yellow dot on top would assume that there is no new policy initiatives or no new real impetus to reduce carbon past 2020. That's 33% by 2020. That's sort of current policy before the recent legislation. And emissions can trend down a little bit. That's because there's going to be a fair number of coal retirements in the West, regardless of whether there's a clean power plan or an SB 350 or a big greenhouse gas emission reduction. It also because the gas fleet, especially in California, is going to get much more efficient than it is today. And that's really because of in California, where the trigger was the so-called once-through cooling rules, where all of the Korean War era gas plants are being retired and are being replaced with modern, more efficient gas plants. So we're really coasting from 2020, and we coast downward. But to the extent that we're trying to achieve the policy objectives of deep carbon reductions, we have to do a lot more. So the other 3 dots out there in 2030, the red, the green, and the blue, represent 3 scenarios that we'll be discussing going forward here. The red and the green dot are 2 different ways of getting to the next policy objective, which is basically 50% less carbon than what we have today, or something on the order of a 50% RPS. Precisely, these are a little bit beyond 50%. These look at a 56 to 58% RPS, and that extra kick over the 50% objective is really to make up for the fact that there's a nuclear plant in California that's going to be retiring in that time frame as well. And so if we're going to hold to the carbon emission reductions, we have to replace that energy with more renewables as well. So red and the green are really looking at a couple of ways of that 50% reduction. The blue is about as far as we think we can go with current technology in sort of the current system design, that we can't really go much below that without doing something different. And so what we did in this study is look at that just to make sure that there wasn't some cliff lurking beyond the 50%, that if we went to 52% or something like that, that we would run into a lot of trouble. But the point of this is, and we'll get back to this right at the end, that with current technology, current resources, we really can't get all the way to an 80% reduction, but we can get fairly close. We can get to a 66, 70% reduction, really without inventing any new technology, without inventing any new paradigm for how we deal with electricity. And the rate impact of doing that, at least in California, depends strongly on natural gas prices, future natural gas prices. At the projections of future natural gas prices, the rate impact is extremely modest. So next, please. Let's go to the next one here, because again, I'm trying not to. And next, please. Okay, these are some of the things that are going to be happening between 2015 and 2030, almost regardless of a policy initiative to reduce carbon. So the first thing that's going on is that by that point in time, there in all likelihood will be a WEC-wide energy imbalance market with some sort of a day-ahead market. We're not talking about a West-wide RTO or ISO or Cal ISO taking over the West. What we're saying is the current market trends for cooperation amongst the balance of the 38 balancing authorities in the West, that there will be a WEC-wide EIM with a day-ahead market, and there will be robust trading across those existing balancing authority lines. But we're not talking about, in this study, a WEC-wide RTO. Second big thing, roughly 1/3 of the coal fleet, plus the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, plus, as I said, that OTC gas fleet, will be retiring in 2030 or before 2030. And that's going to yield a much more efficient and nimble gas fleet than what we have today. That next one is something that's relative to California, and that is, again, back to some of the legacy things that we did in the 1980s to, in this case, combined heat and power or cogeneration. A lot of those facilities are going to be repowered, re-upped in a way that makes them much more efficient. There's going to be significant transmission added to the WEC backbone. The west of Devers line, which is in California, it's an east-west bottleneck in California. Gates-Gregg is a north-south bottleneck in California. Those two additional transmission things have been approved, and they're in permitting or under construction at this point. The SWIP line, which is a north-south bottleneck from southern Idaho to Nevada, that is being talked about, but at this point it has not yet been approved. But in this study, we assume that it has been approved and happened, and that's an important piece of new transmission, but that's about all that we need in order to get to these levels. We haven't talked about rooftop solar, but we assume in this study that the explosive growth in rooftop solar, or the 3-4 kilowatts that goes on people's roofs, continues. And it reaches something like 7 to 10% of retail sales by 2030. Now that's roughly 10 times how much of that solar is out there today. And once you get to that level, you're beginning to saturate that the number of roofs, or the number of the amount of space that you have at this level in order to put solar panels on, that you're either eating into real estate that you could use for something else, or you're putting it in places where through shading or just breakup, or that it really is a suboptimal installation of new solar. So all of these things are going to happen in 2030 to 2050, and they're in all of the cases that we're looking at going forward. We have an aggressive electric vehicle program, 3.3 million electric vehicles by 2030, and we're forecasting for gas price increases from the roughly $2.50 to $3 level that you see today, and the consensus forecast for 2030 is somewhere between $5 and $8 for gas. Next, please. So these are some of the resource portfolios, and we've listed them here by energy and also by capacity, depending on how you do it. And the two cases that we look at here, one we call the target case and one we call the high solar case. And in contrast to what Mark was talking about in his presentation, all of these scenarios call for a very significant increase in solar, mostly solar photovoltaics, as well as wind. And so the total energy, that's the total out there in 2030. The incremental energy is the amount that we would be adding from 2020 to 2030 in order to achieve those carbon reductions. So you're getting to roughly half of the new additions being solar in the high solar case, about a third or so solar in the target case, and you can see a significant chunk of wind, but also a significant chunk of geothermal, which California has in abundance, and just a little bit of biomass. So next, please. That's the same incremental by capacity as opposed to energy, so these are in megawatts instead of megawatt hours, and you can see that in terms of megawatts or the capacity, that solar is a very large fraction of the new added renewables, more so from a capacity standpoint than an energy standpoint, because the capacity factor of new solar is much lower. And so wind and solar take up much of the new capacity. Next, please. This is a rather important detail, if you will, and it's the difference. What we're going to get to is the difference between those the green and the red dots in 2030. And that first red dot talks about conventional flexibility, and the green dot looks at enhanced flexibility. And these are really different ways of thinking about contracts, different ways in which we deal with ancillary services, different ways in which we import and export, and how we trade. And without getting into the details here, case A, or the conventional flexibility, is the way we do it today. Case B, or enhanced flexibility, is the way we can do it based upon the physical capability of these resources, but we're going to have to change the way we think about this. We're going to have to change contracts. We're going to have to change a lot of things in order to make this happen. And the key here is that this is really important. These are details, but they're important details. And next, please. The difference between doing those we show graphically here. Now, this is what is called a duration curve, and if you look at the number of hours in the year, there's 8,760 hours in a year, 24 more in leap year, but if we do all of those things that we physically have the capability to do today, if we utilize the resources that we have and that we're going to be buying in the way that they can be done physically, then we're going to have a system which has very little curtailment. You can see that there are a few hours out of the year, and here let's just say that curtailment is the same thing as what Mark called dispatch. That this is where you could generate energy from the wind and the solar, but you choose not to in order to balance the system. And as Mark was saying, that is expensive, not because it costs a lot of money to do that, but because if you curtail the output, if you dispatch the output down, then you've bought all of that energy, and then you're essentially throwing it away. If you do that with gas plants, as we do today, then at least you save all the fuel cost. And so it's much cheaper to dispatch a system with the fuel costs and saving the fuel cost. And that's the way the market is organized today, to save that fuel cost through dispatch. But everybody dispatches all the time, and everybody will in the future in order to have a reliable grid. But if you get to a point where you are dispatching the wind and the solar a lot, then you get the green curve instead of the blue curve. And the difference between those two curves is, just for California, is over $1 billion a year in lost fuel savings. And then in terms of carbon emissions, almost 8 million tons of CO2, or some 8% of the difference, or of the amount of carbon emissions that we have in today's grid, that you lose by not taking these flexible initiatives to change where we go. So next, please. These are the costs that we're looking at. The net cost as a percentage of the revenue requirement, or the utility expenses, out in the year 2030. If we procure a diverse set of new renewables, and if we have those enhanced flexibility changes, then it's essentially a break-even, or 0.6% increase in costs. And as we go down that list, the less diverse portfolio, but those enhancements, have a 2% increase in cost. The conventional, if we don't change the way we operate the grid today, but we procure that diverse portfolio, you're looking at a 2% increase in cost. If you have the high solar and conventional, then you have a 4% increase in cost. If we factor in issues like differences in gas prices, then I think we can say that the rate impacts of these kinds of these levels are somewhere between 2 or 3% downward pressure on rates to something like 10% increase in rates as we go forward. And those carbon emissions that I talk about, those again are, since there's roughly 100 million tons of carbon being emitted by California's grid, you can almost look at those numbers there as percentage decreases. So that going along with those, you get that level of carbon reductions. And the percent of renewable energy curtailment, if you will, that is the energy that we have lost in order to balance the system, goes from essentially nothing up to roughly 10%. Next, please. This graph here, we're trying to show what energy gets displaced in going from 2020. That's on the left side, and then the energy that gets added. And as you can see, a little bit of coal throughout the West gets displaced as California adds all these renewables, but almost all of the displaced energy is gas. On the added energy side, you can see a mix that depends a lot, again, on this is the diverse portfolio, and that mix of adds is what is in this. Okay, so next, please. Next, yeah, thank you. California today, this we're looking at imports and exports into California. So back, please. I think we went to 2. So if we go, okay. This slide here, the gray line on top is, again, this is another one of those duration curves showing the quantities over the 8,760 hours out of the year. And the gray line is 2013 actual. And as you can see there, California imports, that's roughly 20 to 25% of the energy in California is imported. You can see that there's a few hours out there at the end in 8760 where things dip off, but that they never drop below almost 4,000 megawatts of imports. That happens on light load days in the spring and in the winter. During the summer, on the other hand, where you have the maximum, you can see that California is importing almost 20 gigawatts, or some 40% of its energy in a few hours. That tends to happen on hot summer days. And the other lines there are all of the cases that we're running for 2030. And the two things that you can see from this, number one, or three things. Number one is that going forward, that we are going, California, although still a net importer, is going to be importing significantly less than what it is today. And the second thing about that is that this trade, if you will, these imports, that almost none of those trades in 2030 are fossil, that the fossil imports essentially dry up. And again, if you remember, 1/3 of the coal fleet and the rest of WEC is retiring, and then the gas that is now being imported into California tends to stay home to serve load in Phoenix and Las Vegas and Albuquerque and Denver, and is not available to be exported into California. And then the third thing I would point out is that in many of these cases that we actually have physical exports from California. That's something that does not occur today, but there's no reason why it cannot. And there's good reason to say that many of those it's a very important consideration for that roughly 500,000 hours out of the year where we are physically exporting from California. That helps a lot in terms of keeping the cost down. Next, please. Now, this is another way of looking at that, and that is what we saw before were the physical imports. But what the renewables that we're adding from 2020 to 2030, there's a fair chunk of out-of-state wind that we're adding in this. There's a large assumption of a large build-out of wind in Wyoming and another large build-out of wind in New Mexico. And what happens is that there are times and there are hours in which California is in surplus, and it makes absolutely no sense to be importing anything, whether it's renewables, whether it's nuclear from Palo Verde, and certainly not fossil, at the same time that California is faced with a surplus and is looking to either curtail or try to re-export. So what happens in a dispatch going forward is some of that energy which has been contracted for to come into California and which is renewable is actually drop shipped or sold out of state to serve load out of state. And so those physical imports or physical exports from California that we talked about on the previous slide, even though physically those exports only occur in a few hours, in this slide you can see that maybe as much as 1/3 of the time California is actually selling some of its renewable energy out of state and never importing it. Or another way to look at it would be that maybe some of those Wyoming and New Mexico wind farms would be jointly owned by out-of-state interest and California interest, and that those California interest and out-of-state interest would be trading their entitled energy to make some sort of an optimum in this energy imbalance market going forward. Next, please. Now, Mark talked a little bit about ancillary services, and this is a very important thing going forward, that the source of those ancillary services, if we get them from fossil fuels, then we cannot achieve the levels of carbon reduction that we're talking about. That we have built a system which requires too much gas to operate in order to achieve the carbon reduction goals. So we have to get these ancillary services, which are absolutely necessary to have a reliable grid. We have to get those from these new renewables, or else we're not going to achieve our goals. So all of the things that Mark talked about that are possible, we're going to have to do that over the next 15 years, or we're not going to make it. So again, the green is the gas, and you can see there the contribution again of these conventional versus the enhanced flexibility, how important it is to minimize the size of the green and how important that is to the costs of operating the system and getting the carbon reductions that we talked about. Next, please.
Jim, this is Amanda, and I'm watching the time, and I want to be mindful of people's time and how long we said this webinar would run. So I just want to kind of give you a warning to wrap up so we still have some time for questions. Thank you.
I'm going to skip the next section entirely. I was going to do that anyway, but there's a lot of talk about the difficult days, and you hear a lot about the duck curve and all of these kinds of things. And this next section is just to show that it can happen and it can do it. But again, what's required is to get the flexibility in the contracts and in the business practices so that we can take advantage of the physical capability of the renewables to supply these things. So this next section, which I'll just skip it entirely, and I intended to anyway, is just there so that you know that we've looked at this. We've looked at it on a 5-minute basis, on an hourly basis. The steepest ramps come in the winter, and that's a 13,000 megawatt ramp that you see there. In the spring, we have over-generation in the middle of the day, and these eye charts look pretty wild. And what they're saying is that the people in the control rooms, the people that are deciding these dispatch, are going to be pretty busy on those days. Now, this is a high-load day during the summer, and things look a lot more calm, if you will. So as long as there is enough resources, and sorry about the spelling of enhanced there, but as long as there are enough resources on the system, the summer, which historically has been the difficult days, are just go ahead and skip all these next charts here. This is looking for Department of Water and Power and some things. Okay, we did look at some sensitivities to these results. One of the things we were worried about is suppose the rest of the WEC has an aggressive renewable energy development as well. So we looked at a scenario where the rest of WEC went from roughly 18%, which is where they're headed today, to a 38% renewable energy development. And it didn't really change the results much for California, but it changed it a lot in the rest of the West. And that is clearly one way in which the rest of the West could achieve its Clean Power Plan obligations. We also looked at a study where coal was on the margin rather than gas. That means gas prices remain low, there's a high carbon price, so rather than backing down on gas when you want to dispatch, that we back down on coal. This scenario has, again, little impact on California because California is not importing almost no fossil energy no matter what. But there are major carbon reductions in the rest of the West. And again, those two scenarios really look at something that is beyond the Clean Power Plan compliance in the rest of the West. But we have studied those. We've also looked at drought. And again, these results are relatively robust in terms of dry and wet years for water. Next, please. Just real briefly here, we also, as I said, are looking past 2030. And the dotted lines look at a couple of trajectories as we go forward. And the red dot, if you remember, that says we operate the grid pretty much the way we do today. And what we're saying is that, okay, we can invest our way to buying a lot of new renewables. We can get down to the 2030 target. But if that's where we stay, if we don't change our ways, and then from 2030 to 2050, as the other greenhouse gas reduction things in the transportation sector and in the building sector, and electrification of those to take fossil fuels out of those sectors result in an increased load from electricity, then the carbon emissions from the electric sector tend to go up right back to where we started. Again, the green dot there says that, okay, if we take those measures that we talked about and make those changes, which again are in our minds and our human issues, not physical issues, and really not money issues, they're just human issues, then we can get a grid that can go past 2030. But again, about somewhere in the 2030, 2040s, we have to come up with something else other than this suite of things in order to get to the 80% reductions. Next, please. And these are the principal conclusions, that we can get to our goals. They're technically feasible with today's technology without significant rate impacts, that there's multiple paths with significant different costs to get to these 2030, that the conventional flexibility will get there, but it costs more. If you remember, we're talking about $1 billion a year more cost than just doing what we can with what we have. And then that final thing there is a list of the critical components of enhanced flexibility. And the only comment I'll make in closing is that these critical components, that we need to start working on this list now, that we need to get to this enhanced flexibility before we spend $50 billion on new renewables, or else we're going to have problems, we're going to have friction, and we're going to, so the message that we're trying to give in this low carbon grid study is that we can't wait, that we need to start working on these changes today in order to make this cost-effective transition, or this transition cost-effective in 2030, or to make it at all past 2030. Okay? Yeah. So with that, I'll answer questions from here.
Sounds good. Everybody, we are 5 minutes past the hour where we said we would end. And I appreciate everybody's attendance. We're going to take a couple questions. So if you need to drop off, please do so. But I'm going to take some of the questions that are on the chat box, as well as some of the other ones that have come in. So for, I think, Jim and Mark, this questioner says, you discuss capabilities of wind to provide frequency, voltage control, and ancillary services. How do you provide these when the wind stops blowing? Do you need to overbuild wind? Does geographic diversity take care of them? Could you please elaborate?
Oh, sure, I can take a start at that. I mean, obviously, geographic diversity, especially if you are talking about all of the West, all the WEC, helps a lot because you know, it's very uncommon for there to not be some wind, you know, from some source at any given point in time. But it's not the case either that you expect that you're going to get 100% of these services all from wind or all from solar or all from anything for that matter. You know, it's the diversity of the whole fleet and some of the other flexibility that Jim mentioned, you know, such as the use of storage or other new developments as well. You know, so you have to look at it as a system optimization as a whole and not depending on one resource. For example, we can't get it all from just that one plant, you know, in a conventional sense either, because at any instant in time that plant could be offline. It could have a forced outage and not be there anymore. You know, so it really is an overall system optimization, and you have to look at it that way. And it's not a requirement that, you know, you'd be able to do it all with wind.
Great, thank you,
I
Jim.
think I was going to say, if you also look at solar and you think about solar, clearly east, west, north, south, you get large things. You get 2 time zones. That's huge in terms of dealing with that midday burst of energy from the solar. And you've got, you know, the 1,200, 1,500 miles south to north. So again, and as Mark said, though, when we talk about diversity, we mean not only geographic diversity, but technical diversity. But it really does matter that what we're talking about going forward in the world that we're headed towards, that it's the portfolio that matters. This idea of wind integration or solar integration or integration cost adders or treating these things as silos and treating them as individual resources and talking about how much the integration cost adder for wind or solar is really an obsolete concept that only works below roughly 1/3. As long as the renewables are less than 1/3 of the resources on the system, then you can think about it that way. But as soon as you get into this environment where you're 30 to 50 to 60% renewables, then you have to treat it as a portfolio, not as an individual resource, and that portfolio needs to be diverse both geographically and technically.
Okay, and Jim, this question for you. What does the interior West states need to do to work with California to achieve California's goals and to expand the deployment of renewables in those interior West states? Because everybody looks to California and says, we want to sell there. So they're looking for some guidance on how do we help California meet its goals?
Well, I think that's right. And you know, as I say, historically, we've always, and by we, I mean both us and California and the folks in the interior West, have viewed California as a sink that only imported, and that all of the issues surrounding that. What we're saying here is that going forward, it's robust trade. It's not just imports. It's imports and exports, and it's cooperation, you know, going forward. And the first thing that has to happen, first of all, is just the visibility in real time. That you have to be able to see these things with enough granularity and enough specificity that you can actually act on them. And in my view, the energy imbalance market that is started up, you know, between the Pacific Core and the California ISO, and is due to expand to Arizona, Nevada, the Pacific Northwest over the next 2 years. That's hugely important because it gets all of this up where people can see it in enough time to be able to do something about it, and it provides them a place to park the little differences between what they want to do, you know, ahead and what actually happens in real time. So it allows things to be financially settled, but it also allows that visibility that then you can plan around. So the first thing I think that has to happen is that energy imbalance market just simply has to go, or you can't get here. On the other hand, I don't think it's absolutely necessary that you could go all the way. You don't have to think about going to a West-wide RTO. You don't have to give up your religion. That may happen, it may not down the road, but we shouldn't be, I think, focused on that as a necessity. But we do have to have that energy imbalance market.
Great, okay. I have 3 more questions, and my clock says it's 11 after 2, but I'm going to just go ahead and ask these, and hopefully we'll wrap up here in about 10 minutes. And if you need to drop off, greatly appreciate you attending, and I want to thank Mark and Jim for their time and their substantial expertise on these issues. So one of the questions that came in from a couple different people is, who would you put up as good examples where people could go study who is doing the best job at getting the ancillary and other services from wind and other renewables? Like Mark mentioned Quebec, Hydro-Quebec. Are there entities that you point to say, you know, these guys are really doing it right?
I guess I would answer that. I think ERCOT in Texas is doing a pretty good job. I think the other places to watch for this, one is Hawaii, where they are already out in this regime today, and they're struggling with all of this and trying to figure it out. And what we can learn from Hawaii, I think, is something that is really going to be important, not just for them, but also for us. So Hawaii is a good place to watch. Germany is clearly a good place to watch. They're somewhat ahead of us in terms of trying to get there. They don't have nearly the meteorological resources that we have. In other words, the sun doesn't shine real well, and in many cases the wind doesn't blow as well as us. So we actually have it a lot easier than Germany, but they're going to happen. Ireland is another place as an island which is struggling with these issues today. I don't know, Mark, whether you can think of other places.
No, those are really good examples. Like Ireland is a great case of, and Hawaii. All of the various regions in the country, though, are wrestling with this right now. None of them are perfect, but as you say, some of the stuff going on in Texas and the ERCOT region is quite impressive, and they're really completely redesigning their ancillary services markets now along the lines that Jim mentioned, because they see this coming and they know they're going to have to, assign value to more than just energy, so that they get all the resources cooperating in this way.
Okay, great. Are there other studies similar to what you've done for California for the entire WEC or other WEC states?
We're talking about them. I'm not. There is some studies that have been done that are somewhat relevant to this question, like the Western Wind and Solar Integration studies that were conducted by NREL, which were more technical in nature than policy related that we're talking about here. But clearly, I think with the Clean Power Plan and Clean Power Plan compliance coming up, that there's several people who are talking about doing this kind of thing for the rest of WEC. We're one of those people that we're talking about trying to do something next year to make this WEC-wide. I would also say, though, again, that our study, this low carbon grid study, even though it's focused on California, it really does include all the rest of the WEC. And we have gotten probably 90% of the stuff, and one of the things that we're going to be doing is trying to sort of flip the results so that we can look at results in the rest of the WEC at the same kind of level that we're looking at in California without doing a whole bunch of new modeling.
Okay, great. There's one more technical question that I'm going to skip and let that person ask Jim directly when he sees him sometime, but the other person has asked whether the presentations will be made available today, and the answer is yes, that on the Four Corners Wind Resource Center page, if you go into resources, we actually have all our past webinars, and we have had some fabulous technical experts, so I commend that site to everyone for additional information. So I want to wrap it up here.
I was going to say, I forgot to give our website.
Go ahead.
That's lowcarbongrid2030.org. Lowcarbongrid, all lowercase, no spaces, 2030.org. These phase 2 results will be posted Wednesday of this week.
Great.
In all their gory detail. And certainly call me if you want to follow up on anything.
So thank you, Jim, very much, and Mark, thank you for your time, and thank you, everybody, for your attendance. Look for these on the website. Have a good afternoon.